Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about race relations after World War II, where we will learn all about the changes in Georgia leading up to the Civil Rights Movement. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to explain how technology transformed agriculture and created a population shift within the state. Also, we will explain how the development of Atlanta under mayors William B. Hartsfield and Ivan Allen Jr. impacted the state. Finally, we will describe the relationship between the end of the white primary and the 1946 governor's race. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. Progressives are a group favoring social reform or new ideas. Racial equality is when institutions give equal opportunities to people of all races. Tolerance means the ability or willingness to cooperate with someone different. MARTA is Metro Atlanta's rail transit authority, Atlanta's commuter rail system. The Great Migration was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural South into urban areas. The Three Governors controversy was the political crisis in Georgia, resulting from the death of Governor-elect Eugene Talmadge. The white primary was the nomination elections, where only white voters were permitted to participate. Unconstitutional means not in accordance with the U.S. Constitution, therefore not allowed to be a law. During World War II, the African American soldiers were treated with equality for the first time in American history. It didn't matter the color of your skin in battle. Any soldier could be a hero in a war, and we needed many heroes during World War II. When those soldiers came home after 4 years of fighting, many of them were surprised to find that their heroism was not acknowledged by their communities. Nothing had changed in the homeland they fought so hard for. Recognizing change could happen, those soldiers became some of the earliest to protest for equal rights. In Georgia, we would see that the equal treatment for all races would start in the big cities and would take a lot longer to take hold in the more rural areas of the state. For this reason, in the post-World War II years, you will notice that Atlanta's mayors tend to be much more open-minded during this era, while Georgia's governors, which still rule over a mostly rural state, tend to be much more resistant. Two of Atlanta's early progressive mayors were William Hartsfield and Ivan Allen Jr. In addition to moving the needle forward on social issues like racial equality, these mayors also made huge improvements to Atlanta's economic growth. William B. Hartsfield coined Atlanta as, quote, "the city too busy to hate." That gives you a very quick and dirty understanding of how he felt about racial tolerance. He was a huge supporter of the Civil Rights Movement and a leader of the integration of Atlanta public schools. Integration means combining white and black schools into one school rather than separate schools. Hartsfield's leadership during the Civil Rights Movement kept much of the racial violence, as seen in other cities, out of Atlanta. Additionally, Hartsfield had huge economic contributions to the city, the airport and highway system. Hartsfield was instrumental in opening Atlanta Airport in 1925, which was renamed Hartsfield Airport after his death. He also participated in the planning of our highway network in and around the city. Between the airport and the highway, Hartsfield's transportation systems helped bring billions of dollars of economic activity through our capital. Ivan Allen Jr. was another Atlanta mayor who worked to improve the city socially and economically. On his first day as mayor, he took down the coloreds-only and whites-only signs around the city capitol building as a symbol that Atlanta would no longer be two communities, but one united community. Allen was a leader in the proposal to bring a commuter rail line to Atlanta, which would eventually become the MARTA system. But Ivan Allen is most known around Atlanta for turning the city into a major league city. He brokered the deals to bring 3 professional sports teams to Atlanta: the Braves, Falcons, and Hawks. Before the 1960s, all pro sports teams were centered in the Northeast United States, and many sports leaders didn't think teams would be supported in the South or West. Allen convinced the heads of Major League Baseball, the National Football League, and the National Basketball Association that Atlanta was ripe for sports, and he was right. The construction of stadiums and running of sporting events brought millions of dollars and thousands of jobs to Atlanta, and led to more events coming to town, including the Olympics later on. So what? How did technology and leadership affect a community? Atlanta is starting to look pretty sweet in the 1950s through 1970s, especially compared to rural Georgia. All of that economic growth and social change is happening in the big cities, but very little has changed at all outside the cities. In southern Georgia, in the coastal empire, in the mountains, we're still talking about sharecropping and tenant farming. We're still talking about segregated restrooms, restaurants, and buses. Schools are still segregated, and white students are still getting much better educations than black students. In the 1910s through 1970s, there was a mass migration of blacks out of the rural South and into southern and northern cities. This great migration was partially due to the previously described economic opportunities. It was also partially due to the social changes and racial tolerance that had begun to appear in the big cities, but it was also largely due to the technological change in agriculture. When Henry Ford invented the automobile, he also invented an engine which could be put into other mechanical tools, like tractors, reapers, and other farming machinery. A small farm that once could be worked by 100 sharecroppers now could be worked by a single family sharing heavy machinery with a couple other nearby family farms. Farming became highly profitable in Georgia once again, since farm owners didn't need to pay nearly as many people's salaries for working the farms, and many farms grew huge in size. Those who lost their work in farming, let's be honest, it was mostly black sharecroppers because rural Georgia. They moved into cities to work in factories. While the leadership of Atlanta was quite progressive, the state as a whole was less so. During the Great Depression era, you should remember an individual named Eugene Talmadge. He was Georgia's governor who refused the New Deal jobs and money in Georgia for less than noble reasons. Well, he would go on to win election again a few years after that episode. His election in 1946 led to one of the more embarrassing moments in Georgia's history, making Georgia's politics a nationwide laughingstock. The 1946 governor's election is known as the Three Governors Controversy. Eugene Talmadge won the election, but he died due to poor health before taking office. According to the Georgia Constitution, if the governor dies, then the lieutenant governor should take the office, who was Melvin Thompson, a member of the anti-Talmadge opposition. Additionally, Talmadge's son Herman felt that he had a claim to the office because he was family, and many voters just wrote Talmadge on the ballot since Eugene's health problems were well known. Finally, the outgoing governor, Ellis Arnall, refused to give up his office until the Georgia Supreme Court made their decision. The decision of the court was that Melvin Thompson was the rightful governor until a special election could be held the following year. Georgia voters continued to show their resistance to change by electing a second Talmadge as governor, with Herman taking over his father Eugene's former office. But how did Eugene win that contested election of 1946 originally? The year prior, courts heard a case regarding the white primary. If you remember the white primary from the Jim Crow lesson, this disenfranchisement tactic prevented black politicians from ever being on the ballot in general elections because only white voters could participate in the nominating process. The courts declared the white primary unconstitutional. However, Eugene Talmadge ran on the promise of reinstating the white primary. Didn't work, but once again, that gives you a better understanding of where Georgia voters were in the 40s. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? The early 1900s were a huge shift in Georgia's and many southern states' economies due to farming technology. This may be one of the earliest times in human history where people lost their jobs to machines. Fortunately, other machines and factories were creating jobs at the time, so there were other opportunities, but that may not always be the case. Looking to our future, computers and mechanization are starting to become another economic problem for our world. Think for a second about what job you might want to do in your future. Could a computer or robot do that same job? If so, that job may not even exist by the time you are an adult and enter the workforce. I know that for my job, teaching, it's already possible for classes to be taught online, and someday they may all be taught online. Have you seen the McDonald's restaurants where they've started building kiosks where you order on a tablet instead of talking to a cashier? Or at Walmart and Target stores that have self-checkout but also have 20 empty checkout lanes where cashiers used to work? Technology can transform the economy significantly, and that means that jobs change, so people must also change to keep up. Want to get ahead of the curve and try to find a job that won't be replaced by technology someday soon? Check out computer programming. When I first went to college at Georgia Southern, I wanted to be a computer programmer and failed miserably. Because even in 2003, the students that were at the top of my computer class had been programming for fun since middle school, and I hadn't programmed a single line of code yet. Learn how to type on a keyboard, try to get into the technology connections classes in high school, play around with coding at home. There are plenty of internet programs and YouTube tutorials that teach it. Those are the best pieces of advice I can give you to make sure you aren't replaced by a machine someday. Wow, so learning about post-World War II Georgia is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? Which of the following answer choices explains how and why farms changed in Georgia after World War II? X. Brought transportation to the state, support for the civil rights movement. Y. Brought sports teams to Atlanta, more active in the civil rights movement. Use the clues in the boxes to match the correct people to each set of clues. What do William Hartsfield and Ivan Allen Jr. have in common? The Three Governors controversy began as a result of... When the white primary was ended, what changed in Georgia politics? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about Georgia following World War II. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study for this lesson. Bye now.